If you look at most of the great modernist artists, the writers, the painters, the musicians, they saw themselves as magicians. Art, therefore, is magic. Art is a form of magic in every sense.
A number of different artists did conceive of themselves as, maybe not so specifically as the word priest, but as visionaries. They definitely felt that they had insights into the world that perhaps ordinary mortals did not have. It is those insights that they wanted to communicate to the spectator.
I'm the General Secretary of the Theosophical Society in England. The Society was formed in 1875, so we're more than 100 years old. We have three objects: to encourage the study of comparative religion, philosophy, and science, to form a nucleus of the universal brotherhood of humanity without distinction of race, creed, sex, caste, or colour, to investigate unexplained laws of nature and the powers latent in man.
A century of the avant-garde, almost 100 years since modernism began, and there's still a skeleton in the art cupboard, a slightly shameful secret. Occultism. And in particular, a somewhat wacky cult called Theosophy.
All the major artists were affected by it. Many, of course, reacted against it negatively. Atheists and agnostics contemptuously rejected it. But because of the very strong, although often hidden, spiritual current in both modern art and more particularly modernist art, Theosophy had a very profound influence, albeit often obliquely and indirectly, on the art at the beginning of this century.
But for decades after the First World War, historians of modernism preferred to play down or deliberately ignore the occultist beliefs of some of the early abstract painters. Kandinsky and Mondrian first among them.
It's just amazing that so many historians did not want to look at or explore occultism. And I think that had to do with the fact that they were very worried that because abstraction was so hard to understand, if you associated it with fringe groups like occultism, that would somehow denigrate the great experiments that painters had made in the early years of the 20th century.
The secret of occultism remained in the cupboard because the art chroniclers were intent on ignoring it. What they wanted was not the mumbo-jumbo of the ancients, but a confident new art for the modern age. And they found it with Cubism, which broke through in 1907. Cubism was the shock of the new, all right. The everyday world of bodies, bottles, tables, and newspapers, redesigned with geometric outlines, hard edges, and machine-age regularity. Cubism seemed downright anti-religious, a clean break with the past. But there were some early abstract pioneers who developed their ideas light years away from the down-to-earth bottles and chairs that fascinated Picasso and Braque. Artists such as Kandinsky in Germany, Malevich in Russia, Kupka in Czechoslovakia, and Mondrian in Holland. They were all primarily concerned, with that most ancient and unmaterial of phenomena, magic. Far from being children of the new century, making a clean break with the past, these first abstract painters had a far more lofty purpose: spiritual interaction with the cosmos. The dawn of the 20th century was an uneasy time for Jesus, and for divine inspiration in general. After Darwin, it took a lot of faith still to believe that the world was created in 6 days. While congregations were shrinking, a dazzled audience for the amazing inventions of science was growing. Science had become the new religion.
This was accelerating to such a degree that people were beginning to panic. They had the sense that on the one hand they'd lost their spiritual roots and their spiritual identity, but on the other hand they were rapidly being swamped by the new industrial society.
We notice increasingly people moving away from the church, ceasing to believe in God. And of course, as that very well-known saying goes, if you cease to believe in God, it doesn't mean that you then don't believe in anything. It means that you're likely to believe in everything.
And so you got the appearance of hundreds and indeed thousands of splinter movements, small cults, tiny churches, as people tried to re-establish a sense of the numinous, a sense of their contact with spiritual reality. Like many crazes, the spiritualist craze first gripped the upper classes, the people with the leisure to enjoy it. People played with Ouija boards, they read journals. And above all, of course, they held seances. And in a certain sense, the seance is a kind of very grand party or after-dinner entertainment. You invite your friends to dinner, and then after dinner you say, well, now let's clear the table and all sit round and hold hands and see if we can summon up the spirit of Aunt Fanny for an amusing 5 minutes.
It was amidst this reverence for hocus pocus that Theosophy was born in 1875 in America. Delivered of a mysterious Russian aristocrat called Helena Blavatsky, the most ingenious and influential con woman of the 19th century. Her early life is obscure. Blavatsky claimed she'd ridden bareback in a circus, fought with Garibaldi, and toured Serbia as a concert pianist. She was a natural challenger of reality.
Blavatsky was a rather odd-looking person. She was always stout. She had this frizzy hair, and she had these very broad Russian features. But what everyone remarked of who met her was the piercing eyes. They were quite remarkable, and people have said that when she looked at you, it was as though she was looking into your soul.
She was a strikingly ugly woman, but she had great physical and spiritual magnetism. She had tremendous charm. She could attract almost anybody against their will. And indeed, there seems to have been in this power to attract an element of hypnotism.
One person Blavatsky captured with her hypnotic powers was a down-on-his-luck lawyer, Colonel Henry Olcott. After meeting at a séance, they decided to go into partnership. This was Blavatsky's entry into the spiritual big time.
And they try various projects. They gather a small band of associates who are all interested in the same phenomena, psychic phenomena, in the occult. They don't know what to call this society, so they flip through a dictionary, and somebody comes upon the word theosophical. Theosophical means the love of the divine. This is perfect. the love of divine wisdom indeed, and so they call their society the Theosophical Society. Her idea was to write a set of volumes about the new spiritual science they were finding, which would take in really the whole history of religion in the world. And she did this by the most extraordinary means. She did it not by consulting books, she said, but by spiritual dictation. That her books were written under the influence of certain spirits who told her what to say, or in some cases, rather amazingly, even wrote the books for her. On one occasion, she's said to have come down in the morning to find 30 pages on her desk, which had been transcribed overnight by some spiritual force.
Blavatsky said, and Mahatma said through her, that there is a basic core of truth which is expressed in all the religions. And when you study the writings or sayings of the major religions, you find the founders were all saying very much the same thing. They're all paths, but all leading in the same direction.
And this was a revelation, and it prompted many readers of these early theosophical works to embrace a certain notion of the irrational, a certain notion of the impossible, the incoherent, the opaque, as something creative, something positive, something desirable, which might lead you to a deeper level of understanding.
Blavatsky's books sold, and their ideas fired the fin de siècle imagination. Interest in them continued to grow after her death in 1891. She was so notorious, even 20 years after her death, that T.S. Eliot based his character Madame Sosostris on her, in the most important of all modernist poems, The Waste Land. Her fame was impervious to almost monotonous denunciations of her as a charlatan, but the Edwardian chatterers in the burgeoning avant-garde took little notice of such criticisms. Everybody who was artistically anybody was talking about theosophy.
Yes, everyone knew about theosophy. Theosophy in the 1890s and 1900s was really flavour of the month, if you like, or flavour of the decade.
Theosophy was an idea whose time had come, for with the turn of the century came the dawning of the first New Age movement. It was impossible to escape the new spiritualist zeitgeist. Theosophy was only one of several cults and vogues jostling for attention, particularly from writers and artists. The most unexpected of painters were caught up in this obsession with the occult. We now know that Picasso, a robust atheist and an artist often associated with abrasive modernity, spent many a turn of the century evening smoking opium and reading tarot cards. And that Modigliani was partial to attending seances and even painted his experiences of calling up spirits from the great beyond. But it was theosophy that cornered the market in obscurantism. At the turning of the century, the Theosophical Society had opened lodges all over Europe, gathering many thousands of followers. Amongst them were an extraordinary number of painters and writers. W.B. Yeats was just one poet who was an enthusiastic member at this time. He announced that next to poetry, magic is the most important pursuit of my life. And theosophy was made for Paul Gauguin. His troubled spirit created religious paintings only after a complete surrender to theosophical teachings, a fact played down by historians until only recently. But amongst painters, Piet Mondrian was the one who made the biggest plunge into the occult, trying to make art out of his theosophical beliefs. Although in time he became characterized as the ultimate clean-cut modernist, Mondrian spent many years as a card-carrying, not to say devoted, theosophist. And the familiar square and grid abstract pictures that Mondrian produced in the 30s and 40s did not emerge just from a study of pattern, colour and line. These works have their roots in theosophical teachings that Mondrian took pretty literally. But if you visit an exhibition of Mondrian's work, like this major retrospective at The Hague in Holland, it becomes easier to see how theosophy got left out of the picture in the writing of art history.
No, I don't see any theosophy in those paintings here in this gallery. A lot of people think that we neglected very purposeful the theosophy in this exhibition, and we did. Because theosophy and whole spiritualism, for me, means for Mondrian a much more moral support than it is a real influence on his art. He's not a theosophical artist, as I see it.
Not a theosophical artist? The art establishment is still determined to rewrite Mondrian's history. Down in the museum vault are some of Mondrian's most explicitly theosophical works. They don't fit. They seem banal and gaudy to the critical modernist eye. And when the exhibition moves to America later this year, this Mondrian triptych will be staying behind.
There is an enormous difference between Mondrian's early work and what we now take to be Mondrian. Indeed, if one sees some of those paintings in which he consciously tries to incorporate ideas derived from theosophy, like that evolution triptych, one can actually find them almost shocking.
And it's very fascinating that in one side of the painting her eyes are closed as she is in the middle of meditation. But in the very center, in the largest triptych, her eyes are wide open, as though she has now reached that higher state of consciousness. But you also might note, if you focus in, that the eyes have been somewhat geometricized. And for Mondrian, he's trying to geometricize the eyes to suggest that she has ascended to a heightened state of consciousness, influenced by Blavatsky's ideas that God geometricized.
By the time Mondrian had painted the Evolution triptych, he had been a member of the Theosophical Society for 3 years. He was in good company. At least 300 other Dutch artists were members at this time.
Mondrian joined it because he was interested in finding kindred souls who would help support his search for greater understanding of the world. This is crucial for Mondrian, but for many other artists in the early years of the 20th century. This attempt to really understand the universe. They felt that just by looking at ordinary day-to-day matter, that wouldn't give them the keys to the universe.
Mondrian decided to join the Theosophists in 1909, after his first summer in the Dutch village of Domburg, a trendy retreat for avant-garde spiritualists. Mondrian went there nearly every summer until the Great War started. And it is in the work he did at Domburg that the first signs of abstraction emerge.
All the time, I'm driven to the spiritual, even outside myself. Through theosophy, I became aware that art could provide a transition to the finer regions, which I will call the spiritual realm.
It was very important that he find some ordinary way to communicate these philosophical ideas about improving the world. Painting the landscape, but increasingly making it more simplified, was for him one of the steps toward finding more universal forms.
Observing sea, sky, stars, I sought to indicate their plastic function through a multiplicity of crossing verticals and horizontals. Impressed by the vastness of nature, I was trying to express its expansion, rest, unity.
At first glance, you'll see a lot of vertical, horizontal lines intersecting. What's very fascinating about this in relation to occultism and theosophy is that this directly relates to Blavatsky's concept that vertical and horizontals are the basic universal forms. For Blavatsky, geometry was essential. It's what distinguished the ordinary world from the higher worlds.
Can the physicist tell us? Aye, he sees. But does he comprehend the secret ciphered characters traced by the divine finger on every seashell in the ocean's deep? God geometricizes, said Plato.
In nature, you'll never see a straight line. So geometry would have been a structural sign of God's hand.
I don't want to sound too cynical, but ideas of the theosophical kind, ideas which argued for the existence of a level of reality higher than the merely material, came in extraordinarily handy to those pioneer abstract artists who were trying to convince the public at large, and probably chiefly themselves, that there was a great deal more to abstraction than merely the process of making patterns.
But Mondrian was not the only giant of modern painting for whom the occult revival came just at the right time.
In the 21st century, this earth will seem a paradise compared to what it is now. Literature, music, and art are the first and most sensitive spheres in which the spiritual revelation will be felt.
Kandinsky was very committed to using art as a way of changing the world. He really believed that the goal of the artist was to use his work to heighten men's consciousness, to somehow bring about a greater sense of morality, a greater sense of ethics. He spoke about the artist as being a kind of messiah. A movement such as Theosophy that talked about the 21st century as being a utopia, that held out such promise.
Vasily Kandinsky's Russian heritage and nomadic career paralleled Blavatsky's. Viewed as the father of abstract expressionism, it is not much known that Kandinsky spent his early years as a painter immersed in occultist ideas.
The soul is emerging, purged by trials and sufferings. The spiritual life, to which art belongs and of which she is one of the mightiest elements, is a complicated but definite movement forward and upward.
Kandinsky believed the era in which he lived heralded the awakening of the age of Aquarius. He was determined to produce art that would take him there.
Every man who steeps himself in the spiritual possibilities of his art is a valuable helper in the building of the spiritual pyramid, which will someday reach to heaven.
Large sections of the population really were convinced that everything was heading inexorably towards a kind of utopia, towards a golden age. And certainly Kandinsky believed that if his art were successful, if the new language of abstraction which he was trying to forge actually worked, it would be the appropriate visual language for this new golden epoch.
In 1911, Kandinsky and his friend the painter Franz Marc started to exhibit and correspond with other artists using the name The Blue Rider. Kandinsky wrote,
"We must show that something is happening everywhere. Theosophy must be mentioned briefly and powerfully."
They corresponded with artists all over Europe who were also wrapped up in hocus pocus. Fellow painter Paul Klee and Schoenberg the composer became closely involved. The occult was by now at the peak of its powers on the international art scene.
These circles that he lived in encompassed a number of artists who were interested in theosophy. The woman that Kandinsky lived with, Gabriela Munter, she herself had a long-standing interest in occult books and concepts. So it was an environment directly around him which expressed interest in occult ideas.
Kandinsky and his circle lapped up the ideas of the German president of the Theosophical Society. A teacher cum guru, Rudolf Steiner emphasized the Christian heritage above the Eastern religions, something his own paintings explored. Kandinsky attended Steiner's Munich lectures, and his heavily annotated copies of Steiner's lecture notes on color still survive.
Kandinsky was very influenced by Steiner's color theories, and particularly what Steiner said about the way in which specific colors can convey a feeling in a quite specific way. So that, for example, there is obviously a difference between red, it's aggressive, it's dynamic and assertive, and blue, receding, shy, self-effacing, and so on. Kandinsky's colour theories are obviously much more complicated than this, but they do begin with these sort of basic statements about the primary colours and the primary forms.
Blue is the typically heavenly color. The ultimate feeling it creates is one of rest, supernatural rest. Red, as seen by the mind and not by the eye, produces spiritual harmony. Color is a power which directly influences the soul. The artist is the hand who touches one key or another to cause vibrations in the soul.
Living as he was at the time, at least during the summer, in this Upper Bavarian village of Murnau, he would go out and paint the same motif over and over again, simplifying, making the colours brighter, taking increasing liberties with what he saw, so as eventually to arrive at a kind of expressive paraphrase of the motif. Then, armed with the basic building blocks of a visual language, he began to, as he called it, improvise. That's to say, paint out of his head, or rather, as he would probably have preferred to put it, paint out of his heart, out of his soul.
Kandinsky was obsessed with being able to reach a higher state of consciousness. In 1904, he and Gabriele Munter had traveled to Tunisia, where they saw whirling dervishes. These mystics could reach a state of trance by praying and through dancing. Thus elevated, they would feel no pain as they inserted glass into their mouths or even sabers through their stomachs. What most excited Kandinsky was the thought of being able to get people to attain their superior selves just by looking at his paintings.
What is very important for Kandinsky and occultism is the concept of the work of art itself, creating a meditative state for the spectator. That is a very important way of understanding what abstraction is about. He wanted to draw the viewer in. He wanted to literally attract him and make the viewer stop in his tracks and then look at the works, almost become in a meditative trance as he was looking at the works of art. He did really feel that the struggle to understand it could somehow lead the spectator to a higher consciousness.
Intent on this pursuit, Kandinsky drew on contemporary occultist ideas and photographic experiments in which mediums recorded previously invisible auras. His extensive library was full of occult journals and books, and included many on mediumistic photography. Gabriele Munter wrote later that Kandinsky even made his own occultist photographs, though these have mysteriously disappeared.
The occultist believes that each human being has a sort of invisible light around his body which could be seen under certain conditions. They believe too that the photographic sensible plate could see it too. So they try to photograph those aura around the body. They try to photograph the forms of emotions too. They went into a dark room looking if the human hand has an invisible light which could impress the photographic plate.
Mediumistic photography was important because it represented a pseudo-scientific way of capturing the invisible, that is, capturing spirits on something that would be accessible to the public. Certainly, artists did make use of that. In Kandinsky's own paintings, there's one called Painting with White Form, where if you compare it with some of the books of mediumistic photography, which he himself studied, and he made references to this, you can see shapes from some of these photographs in that particular painting.
Occult photographs were also plundered by the two leading English theosophists who had taken over from Madame Blavatsky. In 1901, C.W. Leadbeater and Annie Besant started to produce a wildly eccentric series of books about what they called psychic chemistry. In doing so, they stumbled into making some of the first modern abstract images, pretty much by accident. The feelings and emotions that photographs could only show in black and white, these bogus clairvoyants claimed they could illustrate in color. Their book, Thought Forms, was pored over by artists across Europe, including Kandinsky and his circle, who snapped it up when it appeared in German translation in 1908.
The book exerted a quite crucial influence, and there are illustrations of specific emotions, and these illustrations are sort of vague, amorphous blobs in a variety of colours. Now, interestingly enough, we find very similar blobs in paintings by Kandinsky, before the First World War particularly. And there's no doubt in my mind that this is where they come from. Kandinsky wanted to invent a kind of abstract language, a visual language which didn't rely on references to the real world, in order to make paintings which much more powerfully expressed emotions and states of mind than any paintings in the history of art had ever been able to do. Now that meant that he had to believe, or had to make himself believe, that colours and forms were capable of themselves of expressing these things quite specifically. And it was at this point the more imaginative subjects came in, because he would then apply this basic visual language to a subject, for example, like a battle, in order to express the feeling of conflict. Cossacks looks at first sight like an arrangement of lines and colours, until you notice there are two Cossacks on horseback, locked as though in combat. You can see their red Cossack hats. He was trying to convey the feelings of conflict, feelings connected with a battle scene, by simplifying, attempting to arrive at the visual essence of what a battle is all about. So that, at the point, he actually did arrive at complete abstraction. That's to say, him sitting down and composing straight out of his head.
However, the spiritual in art was set to receive a blast of reality. Even the most ethereal of artists was about to be brought down to earth. The First World War shattered the New Age sensibilities that artists like Kandinsky had shared. Many of the key occultist artists, such as Franz Marc, were killed in the trenches. Death and destruction brought much more material realities to the mind. Above all, the world was now a different place. Theosophy and its related ideas now seemed irrelevant and plain daffy in an era which was midwife to the twin birth of communism and fascism.
After the First World War, there was a really renewed interest in using art to communicate with the vast public. Artists such as George Grosz said that abstraction was just twaddle. It was just too removed from ordinary people to be able to communicate. In fact, some of these critics and artists in the early 20s actually used the concept of occultism in a very derogative way.
Many artists now felt themselves to be part of a social rather than spiritual revolution. The Soviet Union seemed to represent a new future. The new art was to be self-consciously modern.
The very idealistic view that art could actually change the way people felt, think, and act was destroyed ultimately by the First World War. And we can see this actually in constructivism. Art itself became very technological. very level-headed, almost bone-headed, very direct, and very anti the kind of metaphysics which so inspired Kandinsky and Mondrian, and I must say, continued to inspire Kandinsky and Mondrian, even during this period when, for the vast majority of people, these ideas were no longer valid.
But there was one important last stand for Hocus Pocus. It happened at a most unlikely place, the Bauhaus School of Applied Art and Architecture in Germany.
If I say to you the word Bauhaus, what you think of are flat-roofed houses, white concrete walls, tubular steel furniture and so on. And yet, in 1919, when the Bauhaus was founded, it wasn't like this at all. It was very much directed to what I might best describe as mumbo-jumbo and metaphysics, what more politely would be described as expressionist utopianism.
The director of the Bauhaus and archetypal modernist, Walter Gropius, was interested enough in occultist ideas to make a point of hiring a mystic art teacher, Johannes Itten, when the school first opened. They were introduced by Gropius's wife, Alma Mahler, a full-time dabbler in the occult. But Johannes Itten was to be unceremoniously dismissed, prefiguring the extinguishing of the occult flame in art.
He was interested in one of these curious pseudo-religions called Mazdaznan, which claimed to go back to the teachings of Zoroaster in Persia. He would wander around in monk-like robes, which he designed himself, and taught very much from the point of view of his beliefs, his Mazdaznan beliefs. That's to say, physical jerks, physical well-being, a vegetarian diet, colonic irrigation, all of these things were thought to have a direct effect on one's capacity to be an artist.
But the Bauhaus students were far more interested in the Russian Revolution than in yoga. To them, attaining higher states of consciousness seemed quaint, irrelevant.
Na, ich zum Beispiel, ich wollte das nicht. Ich wollte es auch nicht. Man wollte frei sein, man wollte sich frei entscheiden und wir waren sehr östlich ausgerichtet. Das kam ja dazu. Also wenn, dann wären wir Bolschewisten geworden, aber niemals Mazdaznan.
Gropius was attacked and the Bauhaus was attacked on every front. Gropius started to become accused of being both too involved with occultism, too involved with communism. He began to see that someone like Itten was too disruptive. Gropius was always pragmatic. He was as utopian in some ways as, say, Kandinsky, but he wanted to make things work. He wanted to make his school run. That led him to embrace technology, led him much more to embrace industrialization, because then the engineer could be in the service of the people. And that was certainly the key for the 20s.
It was in this atmosphere of the artist as engineer rather than as priest that Wassily Kandinsky arrived to teach at the Bauhaus in 1922. By the time he arrived, the spiritual in art had been deliberately sidelined. Kandinsky did not make waves. He stayed for nearly 10 years, a quiet and conformist member of staff. Few heard him mention the unfashionable ideas of his past.
For Kandinsky in the 20s, being exposed to the constructivists, to the greater interest in technology, to the poo-pooing of occultism, he himself became influenced by this emphasis on the engineer, and you find him talking much less about occultism and talking much less about theosophy.
And Kandinsky ceases to use nature-based, organic abstract language, and himself becomes increasingly a geometric abstract artist. He's never exclusively one, but his compositions are much more tight, much less improvised, much less free, much more, in a funny kind of way, scientific.
Kandinsky now lived here in specially built quarters for tutors, courtesy of the Bauhaus. This was a world light years away from his occultist experiments in Bavaria. Clean, sharp, hard, direct. These were the qualities that would come to define modernism. But the lessons Kandinsky taught his Bauhaus students still contained in muted form the golden threads of his pre-war spiritual explorations.
Kandinsky's courses at the Bauhaus sought to provide students with a kind of visual grammar with which they could make not only paintings if they wanted to, but actually designs of any kind. And interestingly enough, a lot of these courses were based on the attempt scientifically to justify and demonstrate the truth of entirely subjective things. Colour and what you can communicate through colour, form and what you can communicate through that. They were trying to go right back to basic assumptions and to help students, and this I think is the important thing, not make copies of the real world, but they're going to express their feelings, ideas, attitudes and so on.
Für uns war eigentlich schon die Meinung von Kandinsky maßgebend. Also Dreieck gelb, das fanden wir auch.
I do think that just the very fact that Kandinsky remained committed to abstraction and believed that abstraction can communicate through color and form still reflects some of the earlier interest in the occult ideas. And he still believed that the oil painting itself could be a meditative force, that the spectator could be drawn into the works, and through struggling to understand the works, achieve some kind of higher consciousness.
As for Piet Mondrian, he too learned how to keep quieter about his love affair with the occult. But he continued to be associated with Theosophy until he died, joining the French Lodge of the Society as late as 1938, though the passion was cooler.
Though Mondrian said that he moved away from Theosophy after the First World War, nevertheless, I think really that ideas derived from Theosophy informed his work for the rest of his career.
Living first in Paris and then in New York, Mondrian became increasingly fascinated by jazz and dancing. For him, jazz was the musical equivalent of his painting, free of restricting conventions. He saw the jazz bar as a modern cathedral.
In the jazz bar, free of limiting form, sensuality opens. So does spirituality. The bottles and glasses on the shelves stand, yet they move in color and sound and light. Are they less beautiful than candles on an altar?
From the moment that Mondrian achieved his mature style, he painted exclusively with vertical and horizontal lines, black, white, and the primary colors. He himself, of course, said that he'd got everything from a particular book by Madame Blavatsky called The Secret Doctrine. Madame Blavatsky's thinking was that one arrives at the ultimate state of spiritual grace in terms of a process of evolution by the progressive reconciliation of opposites in order to achieve a harmony. Now, if one looks at Mondrian's development and the way in which his abstract language is absolutely the contradiction of opposites in such a way as to achieve harmony, then I think it does actually make more sense.
Mondrian's final resting place, his New York studio, had the atmosphere of a Zen-like temple. He was fastidious, not to say obsessive, about keeping his surroundings as controlled as his paintings. He painted the stems of flowers because he hated the color green. He kept few belongings. But one thing he did cherish: a portrait of Madame Blavatsky remained in his studio until his death.
Mondrian himself believed that his works of the 20s and 30s were his attempt to pare down all the forms and colors of the world to the most universal shapes. Mondrian believed that his late paintings were getting nearer to the forces that could lead one to God. And he felt that through his studies with Theosophy, he actually had found basic structural principle of the universe.